Plato's Gorgias continues with Callicles picking up the ball that his colleagues had dropped. He gives a pretty accurate diagnosis why they fell short. If we look on page 53, 483a, Callicles says to Socrates accusingly, "If a person makes a statement in terms of law, you slyly question him in terms of nature. If he makes it in terms of nature, you question him in terms of law." That's just what happened here on the question of doing what's unjust versus suffering it. Well, Polus meant that doing it is more shameful by law. You pursued the argument as though he meant by nature. For by nature, all that is more evil is also more shameful, like suffering what's unjust, whereas by law, doing it is more shameful. No man would put up with suffering what's unjust. Only a slave would do so, one who is better dead than alive, who, when he's treated unjustly and abused, can't protect himself or anyone else he cares about. The root of the difficulty is this contradiction that we spoke of last time between an ethic rooted in convention or custom, on the one hand, and an ethic rooted in nature, on the other hand. Callicles says he believes he understands their real relation. Continuing on, Callicles says, "I believe that the people who institute our laws are the weak and the many. They do this and they assign praise and blame with themselves and their own advantage in mind. They're afraid of the more powerful among men, the ones who are capable of having a greater share. And so they say that getting more than one share is shameful and unjust, and that doing what's unjust is trying to get more than one share. They do this so that those people won't get a greater share than they. I think they like getting an equal share, since they are inferior. These are the reasons why trying to get a greater share than most is said to be unjust and shameful by law, and why they call doing it what's unjust." So the natural ethic of justice is something different, according to Callicles. It's that the better man should get a greater share than the worse man. He says, "I believe that nature itself reveals that it's the just thing for the better man and the more capable man to have a greater share than the worse man and the less capable man. Nature shows that this is so in many places, both among the other animals and in whole cities and races of men. It shows that this is what justice has been decided to be, that the superior rule the inferior and have a greater share than they. For what sort of justice did Xerxes go by when he campaigned against Greece, the Persian king who invaded Greece, or his father when he campaigned against Scythia? Countless other such examples could be mentioned. I believe that these men do these things in accordance with the nature of what's just. Yes, by Zeus, in accordance with the law of nature, and presumably not with the one that we institute. We mold the best and most powerful among us, taking them while they're still young, like lion cubs, with charms and incantations. We subdue them into slavery, telling them that one is supposed to get no more than his fair share, and that's what's admirable and just. Indoctrination of the strong to think like the weak. But I believe that if a man whose nature is equal to it were to arise, one who had shaken off, torn apart, and escaped from all this, who had trampled underfoot our documents, our tricks and charms, and all our laws that violate nature, he would rise up and be revealed as our master." So you get the closing, the image that very likely was one of the inspirations for Nietzsche's Übermensch, the man who rises up and recognizes his own mastery and throws off the indoctrination of the slaves who wanted to keep him down and tell him that he's equal and tell him that he should renounce his privilege and all this kind of stuff, who rejects all of that and rises above in order to be the master. That's the natural ethic of justice, that those who are superior should behave like the superior, and that means getting their own just share, which is the greater share. So right off the bat here, I want to point out that I think everyone kind of gets the point of this, gets the natural drift of this, but it contains several ambiguities, and we'll see Socrates will soon exploit these to his argumentative advantage. But right off the bat here, I want to raise a first discussion question in responding to and thinking about, reflecting upon Callicles and what I've just read from him. Is Callicles correct in his view about what natural justice consists of? What makes this natural, if it is? Is it rooted in some primitive physical, biological, or psychological facts? Is it rooted in some imagining of a primordial state of nature in which a pre-civilized humanity supposedly existed? If this is the natural state, what gives it its normative authority? And by that term normative authority, which is an important one in ethical theory, what I mean is what makes it the case that this natural condition, assuming that it is that, let's just take that as an assumption for now, what makes it the case that this natural condition should be respected and gone along with, that we should take it as something that should be abided by? So that's the first discussion question. Is Callicles correct in his view about what natural justice consists of? What makes this natural? Is it rooted in some primitive physical, biological, or psychological facts? Is it rooted in some imagining of a primordial state of nature in which a pre-civilized humanity supposedly existed? If this is the natural state, what gives it normative authority? That is, what makes it the case that this natural condition, assuming it is that, should be respected or gone along with? Callicles also, in this initial aggressive speech against Socrates, also offers a kind of natural rejoinder to Socrates' elevation of the persuasion that is involved in learning. You'll remember that from the previous video. The persuasion that's involved in learning over the persuasion that's involved with conviction. The persuasion that is involved with learning presumably is what the philosopher is engaged with, whereas the persuasion that's involved with conviction is what the orator or the sophist is concerned with. Recall that Socrates had argued that the former sort of persuasion, the persuasion that is involved with learning, had truth on its side, necessarily, whereas the persuasion that's involved with conviction didn't necessarily have that. Callicles asserts that possessing the truth isn't any good if you can't convince others to protect and advance your interests, for this requires the persuasion that leads to conviction. So you might have all the truth in the world on your side, but if the other side, who are your enemies, has the political power, which they obtain through persuading people to be convinced by what they wanted them to be convinced of, which might have been false, if that's the case, then all the truth that you have on your side isn't going to do you any good. And there's a kind of dramatically ironic foreshadowing of Socrates' death, which is recounted in Plato's Apology that the editor made note of here in connection with this. But for Callicles, philosophy seems like an immature idealism. It's like, when you're a young person, you might get real fired up about some radical political cause, but your elders are going to tell you, look, if you're in your 40s, you need to grow up. You need to grow up and get a job and, quit fiddling around with this stuff. And that's essentially Callicles' attitude towards Socrates. In his engagement with philosophy, he needs to grow up. Well, after buttering him up a little bit, no doubt intended to lower his defenses, put him in a well-disposed mood, Socrates summarizes Callicles' position back to him in order to ensure that they're on the same page. And so here's the way he does this on page 59. 488b, Socrates says to Callicles, Please restate your position for me from the beginning. What is it that you and Pindar, the poet that he enlisted as a supporter, what is it that you and Pindar hold to be true of what's just by nature? That the superior should take by force what belongs to the inferior, that the better should rule the worse, and that the more worthy have a greater share than the less worthy? You're not saying anything else, are you? Do I remember correctly? So that's the view, that the superior should take by force what belongs to the inferior, sort of a Nazi or Adolf Hitler ethic. The better should rule the worse, right? Like the master race should rule over. But this is applied primarily to the individual great man. The better should rule the worse, and the more worthy should have a greater share than the less worthy. That's the view that Socrates is going to try to refute. Now, put this way, we can immediately see where the vague and ambiguous terms are in this position. They're centered around the opposition between the superior, better, more worthy, and their opposites. The obvious question here is, how do we determine who is the superior, the better, the more worthy, etc.? And that's, even if you agree with Callicles' position abstractly or schematically, you would want to know, how do we fill this in? How do we determine who these superior, better, more worthy are? And there's an unfortunate history of adolescent or, quite frankly, deranged readers of Friedrich Nietzsche who are inspired by his idea of the Übermensch or the Superman, the Overman, and they identify themselves as being superior or better, and therefore entitled to this kind of aggressive and exploitative attitude towards others. But they were wrong by virtually everyone's admission but themselves. And we need to ask them, how do we determine who this figure is, even if we accept this ethic, which of course ultimately we're not going to do. Socrates, of course, knows that Callicles is talking about the characteristics of the typical strongman tyrant. That's already been established in the context. His predecessors had already mentioned examples. And so Socrates traps Callicles by getting him to admit that the superior is the same as the stronger. This, however, is inconsistent with Callicles' elitism, because the many are the stronger. And according to them, it's unjust to get more than an equal share. So by Callicles' own principle, then this would be a rule of nature as well, that it's unjust to get more than an equal share. This inconsistency between Callicles' elitism, which by definition means that the better are the few or the one, and the fact that the many are the stronger, this forces Callicles to substitute better in the sense of worthier, as he redescribes it a bit further on, to substitute that for stronger. So the better or the worthier instead of the stronger. And Socrates gets him to define this further as the more intelligent. So the worthier, the better are not just the stronger in the sense of brute physical strength, in the sense that 20, social inferiors could overpower one superior man, but rather it's better in the sense of more intelligent. Now, while this eliminates some of the vagueness and ambiguity, it doesn't eliminate all of it, for the simple reason that there are many different species of intelligence. For instance, each one of the distinct crafts involves its own distinctive type of intelligence. And this creates confusion regarding exactly what Callicles is recommending. Two questions arise. First, which kind of intelligence is the privileged type that makes you a better or worthier person? That's the first question. And second, if the answer is, well, we lack a criterion for ranking types of intelligence, so we're just going to say all of them, then how do you determine who gets the greater share, and the greater share of what? And Socrates sort of has fun with this by suggesting, contrary to what he knows Callicles' position is, that maybe Callicles' position is that each person gets the most of the things they're most intelligent about. So on pages 62 through 63, thereabouts, this is around 490, he suggests, what are you saying, Callicles, that the cobbler, the shoemaker, should get the greatest share of shoes, so should have like a huge, shoe collection, like 10 times the size of the Kardashian sisters' shoes? Are you saying that the weaver should get, the most clothes, should walk around wearing them all at once? Something like that. And obviously Callicles realizes Socrates is making fun of him here. He's not thinking of that at all. Rather, he does have a specific type of intelligence in mind. There is a specific privileged type of intelligence. He doesn't give an argument for why this should be the privileged type of intelligence, although I note this for future reference because next time when we talk about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, in the follow-on video to this, we'll go into some considerations as to why this type of intelligence actually is privileged, according to Aristotle. But anyway, the type of intelligence we're talking about is what Callicles describes as those who are intelligent in the affairs of the city. Those who are intelligent in the affairs of the city, about the way it is to be well managed. These are the most intelligent in the relevant sense. Formerly, we call such a person a statesman, and their activity statescraft. Today, we likely call them public policy technicians, technocrats, bureaucrats, social sciences, scientists, and the like, those who are intelligent about public policy. Socrates, of course, knew all along that Callicles would go there, and he anticipated it. And he raises an interesting question. Can one be the ruler of a government if one is not able to rule oneself, to be a master of oneself, self-controlled? An interesting question we might, here in the United States, reflect upon the last, let's say, 30 years or so of presidents and wonder about that. But Callicles actually doesn't worry about this problem because he thinks that being self-controlled is stupid. This is pages 64 and 65, 492a. He says, how could a man prove to be happy if he is enslaved to anyone at all? Rather, this is what's admirable and just by nature. And I'll say it to you now with all frankness, that the man who lived correctly ought to allow his own appetites to get as large as possible and not restrain them. And when they are as large as possible, he ought to be competent to devote himself to them by virtue of his bravery and intelligence, and to fill them with whatever he may have an appetite for at the time. But this is impossible for the many. I believe hence they become detractors of people like this because of the shame they feel, while they conceal their own impotence. And they say that lack of discipline is shameful, as I was saying earlier, so that they enslave men who are better by nature, and while they themselves lack the ability to provide for themselves fulfillment of their pleasures, their own lack of courage leads them to praise self-control and justice. Skipping down to the end of the paragraph, he says, rather, the truth of it, Socrates, is like this. Wantonness, lack of discipline, and freedom. Wantonness is just sort of indulging your appetites without any restraint, right? Wantonness, lack of discipline, and freedom, if available in good supply, are excellence and happiness. As for these other things, these fancy phrases, these contracts of men that go against nature, they're worthless nonsense. This brings us to our second discussion question. What do you think Callicles' claim that wantonness, lack of discipline, and freedom, if available in good supply, are excellence and happiness. Is this a true or plausible or defensible claim? Why or why not? In our own society, are people who live like this admired and their way of life aspired to? If so, does that lend support to Callicles' claim? If not, does it undermine his claim? What implications, if any, does this have for the ethic that one follows? So once again, what do you think about Callicles' claim that wantonness, lack of discipline, and freedom, if available in good supply, are excellence and happiness? Is this a true or plausible or defensible claim? Why or why not? In our own society, are people who live like this admired and their way of life aspired to? If so, does that lend support to Callicles' claim? If not, does it undermine his claim? What implications, if any, does this have for the ethic that one follows? So how does Socrates propose to change Callicles' mind? He proposes to compare the self-controlled man on the one hand and the undisciplined one on the other to each other, side by side, and thereby, in this side-by-side comparison, show the superiority of the self-controlled man. Using an analogy, he compares the one to a filled-up jar and the other to a leaky jar. And you don't need to guess which one is which. However, this analogy depends upon equating pleasure with being filled up and pain with not being filled up. Is this an apt way to describe pleasure? Sure, everyone would want to be a filled up jar and not a leaky jar, if those are the only two choices. And Socrates wants to say that the self-controlled man, since his appetites are under control, is like the filled up jar. The undisciplined one is like the leaky jar. And this is obviously meant to be an analogy for pleasure and pain. That is, pleasure is equated with being filled up and pain is equated with not being filled up. But is this an apt way to describe pleasure? And Callicles, once again, resists this and claims it is not. This is on the center of page 67, 494a. He says, in response to Socrates asking, when I say this, do I persuade you to basically agree with me? And Callicles says, you do not, Socrates. The man who has filled himself up has no pleasure anymore. And when he's been filled up and experiences neither joy nor pain, that's living like a stone. Rather, living pleasantly consists in this, having as much as possible flow in. So Callicles is making an important point here and highlighting the importance of the analysis or the theory of pleasure for ethics. This comes up again to be a major issue in Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics. If ethics concerns happiness, it's plausible to assume, most philosophers would assume, that pleasure has something to do with happiness, some kind of pleasure. But what is pleasure? What is pleasure? What do we mean by pleasure? So we'll be coming back to this question again because it's an important one, not only in Aristotle, but also certainly in Mill later on, John Stuart Mill. So we have a fundamental dispute here between pleasure being something like a state, like the state of being filled up that a jar might be in, the state that it's in, something static, static condition, versus a process of flow, as Callicles is describing it. Well, which is it? How are we to understand pleasure? What's the proper way to understand pleasure? Socrates initially concedes to Callicles his point that pleasure is a process, and he switches tactics to try to get Callicles to admit that there are some pleasures that are shameful, even if they could be indulged in to the heart's content without interruption. So specifically, a lowly pleasure that was the sole pleasure of one's life. So the pleasure is both a kind of lowly or base pleasure, and it's also the sole pleasure of your life. This would not be sufficient for a good life, even if it could be indulged in to the heart's content without interruption. Callicles, however, won't budge from his position initially. Even a man whose sole pleasure in life is to scratch his head would have a happy life if it could be indulged in to his heart's content without interruption. Just spends his life scratching his head. And of course, by the power of suggestion, I caused myself to have an itch by saying that. But he's scratching his head for his whole life. Callicles says, great, that's fine. This person would have a happy life. In response to Callicles' recalcitrance, Socrates tackles the main philosophical issue head on, which is this: whether the pleasant and the good are the same thing or whether they're different things. Whether the pleasant and the good are the same thing or whether they are different things. Socrates, of course, holds that they're different, while Callicles maintains that they're the same. So how is Socrates going to refute Callicles' position? In order to refute him, he first gets Callicles to concede that those who do well have the opposite experience from those who do badly. Those who do well have the opposite experience from those who do badly. Stated that way, that might be a little bit abstract, although it sounds plausible. It rings true. Those who do well have the opposite experience from those who do badly. But we would want examples, and Socrates gives some examples. For example, the healthy have the opposite experience, let's say, of life than the sickly. The strong have the opposite experience from the weak. Even, say, the speedy have the opposite experience from the slow, etc., etc. Those are all examples of illustrations, instantiations of this principle that those who do well have the opposite experience from those who do badly. These cases illustrate the general proposition, Socrates says, they illustrate the general proposition that a person acquires and gets rid of good and bad things successively. A person acquires and gets rid of good and bad things successively. And in particular, a person acquires and gets rid of happiness and unhappiness successively. A person acquires and gets rid of happiness and unhappiness successively. So one doesn't get rid of and keep happiness at the same time, nor does one get rid of and keep what's good and bad at the same time. So we go back to our examples. If you're healthy, then you have to lose your healthiness in order to become sickly. And vice versa. If you're sickly, you lose your sickliness and become healthy. You don't have both at the same time. If you're strong, you have to lose your strength in order to become weak, and vice versa. You don't have them at the same time. You're not strong and weak at the same time. In the same respect, of course. Similarly, if you're speedy and you become slow, break your leg or whatever, you become slow, you're not at the same time speedy and slow. And same with being slow. If you become speedy, you have to, as it were, relinquish your slowness in order for that to happen. So a person acquires and gets rid of good things and bad things successively. And in particular, a person acquires and gets rid of happiness and unhappiness successively. So one doesn't get rid of and keep happiness at the same time, nor does one get rid of and keep what's good and bad at the same time. So that's a pretty straightforward, probably pretty controversial point that we're likely to accept. But for these considerations, Socrates makes an argument to show that pleasure cannot be the same thing as goodness or happiness, which is, of course, what he wants to do to refute Callicles, to show that pleasure cannot be the same thing as goodness or happiness. And so the argument goes like this. I will read this out slowly. repeating every premise twice and then repeat the whole argument all at once, more quickly. So premise 1 is just the principle that was discussed a minute ago. Premise 1, one doesn't get rid of and keep happiness at the same time, nor does one get rid of and keep what's good and bad at the same time. Once again, premise 1, one doesn't get rid of and keep happiness at the same time, nor does one get rid of and keep what's good and bad at the same time. Premise 2, thus, if there is something that people do keep and get rid of at the same time, this cannot be the good or happiness. Premise 2, thus, if there is something that people do keep and get rid of at the same time, this cannot be the good or happiness. Premise 3, every deficiency or appetite, such as hunger or thirst, is painful. Every deficiency or appetite, such as hunger or thirst, is painful. I don't think we've arrived at any controversial premises that need additional justification so far. Premise 4, the filling of every deficiency or appetite is experienced simultaneously as a deficiency appetite and as a pleasure. The filling of every deficiency or appetite is experienced simultaneously as a deficiency or appetite and as a pleasure. And this one's a little bit more complex. It might benefit from a word of interpretation. So what he seems to have in mind here is that if, after Thanksgiving, Christmas dinner, what have you, I've stuffed myself and I just can't eat anything more, then I'm not going to be able to derive pleasure from eating. In every case where I'm deriving pleasure from eating, I'm driving the pleasure from filling up an appetite. So I'm experiencing the appetite. There's going to be, in other words, some sense of deficiency, however slight. To say that the appetite is a kind of pain isn't to say it's a great pain, but it's to say that there's some little bit of emptiness that I'm filling. And of course, the greater the appetite, the greater the pain, the more hunger pangs I have, for example, the more pleasure I'm going to get from filling it. So there's a kind of proportion there between the pleasure I get and the pain that's coming from the appetite. And these are experienced simultaneously. I have to be experiencing an appetite in order to enjoy my food. It has to be there at the same time as I'm eating my food. So this, I think, here is where we get to and we can, of course, think of examples from other, cases of appetites, whether it's sexual desire or what have you. So this is premise 4. The filling of every deficiency or appetite is experienced simultaneously as a deficiency appetite and as a pleasure. Premise 5. Thus, a deficiency or appetite is experienced as a pleasure and a pain at the same time. Premise 5. A deficiency or appetite is experienced as a pleasure and a pain at the same time. Premise 6. Hence, pleasure and pain are something that people can keep and get rid of at the same time. Pleasure and pain are something that people can keep and get rid of at the same time. Therefore, the conclusion follows that pleasure cannot be the good or happiness. So once again, more quickly, the argument is as follows. Premise 1, one doesn't get rid of and keep happiness at the same time, nor does one get rid of and keep what's good or bad at the same time. Premise 2, thus, if there is something that people do keep and get rid of at the same time, this cannot be the good or happiness. Premise 3, every deficiency or appetite, such as hunger or thirst, is painful. Premise 4, the filling of every deficiency or appetite is experienced simultaneously as a deficiency or appetite and as a pleasure. Premise 5, thus a deficiency or appetite is experienced as a pleasure and a pain at the same time. Premise 6, hence pleasure and pain are something that people can keep and get rid of at the same time. Conclusion, therefore pleasure cannot be the good or happiness. Socrates follows this up with another argument for this conclusion, which is on pages 73 and 74, 497e through 498. And this one can be reconstructed this way. So here we go again, second argument. This one is shorter. The idea here is that, first of all, I'll just state it in terms of the premises, and then we can comment. Premise 1, intelligent and brave men are good, foolish and cowardly men are bad. Premise 1, intelligent and brave men are good, foolish and cowardly men are bad. Premise 2, if goodness and pleasure were the same thing, good men and bad men would not experience pleasure to the same extent in the same situations. Premise 2, if goodness and pleasure were the same thing, good men and bad men would not experience pleasure to the same extent in the same situations. Quick comment on that. The idea is that if you adopt this view of pleasure and goodness being identical, then the goodness just consists in, as it were, having the soul filled up with pleasure. And so good men and bad men would not experience pleasure to the same extent in the same situations, because necessarily the bad men would have to experience less pleasure, because by definition they have less goodness, and goodness just is pleasure. So that's the idea behind premise 2. If goodness and pleasure were the same thing, good men and bad men would not experience pleasure to the same extent in the same situations. Premise 3. However, intelligent and brave men do experience pleasure and happiness, pain and unhappiness to the same extent as foolish and cowardly men in certain situations. So, you can think of any example with the intelligent and the foolish. An intelligent person can enjoy a good meal. I should state it the other way, that a foolish person can enjoy a good meal just as much as an intelligent person, or a hot bath on a cold day or whatever. The foolish can enjoy that just as well as the intelligent. Likewise, he uses these more specific examples of the brave man and the cowardly man standing in line together. You can imagine, in the citizen army of the Greek city-state. And they both experience pleasure at seeing the enemy en route, or pain at seeing the enemy approach aggressively. So they do experience pleasure and happiness, pain and unhappiness to the same extent in certain situations. And this leads to the conclusion that goodness and pleasure are not the same thing. So that's the argument. Quite simple, straightforward, brief argument. We'll go over it again. Premise 1, intelligent and brave men are good, foolish and cowardly men are bad. Premise 2, if goodness and pleasure were the same thing, good men and bad men would not experience pleasure to the same extent in the same situations. Premise 3, however, intelligent and brave men do experience pleasure and happiness, pain and unhappiness to the same extent as foolish and cowardly men in certain situations. Conclusion, therefore, goodness and pleasure are not the same thing. This leads to a third discussion question. Are the arguments that Socrates presents against equating goodness with pleasure cogent ones? Is one or the other a stronger argument in your view? Is there a better way that Callicles could have responded to Socrates? What is the relationship between goodness and pleasure in your view? Is the human good to be identified with pleasure and the bad with pain? Is pleasure a part of the human good, but not the whole of it? If you think that it is part of the good, a part of the good, what are the other parts, and how are they to be balanced against one another? Or are pleasure and the human good totally separate things altogether? So once again, third discussion question. Are the arguments that Socrates presents against equating goodness with pleasure cogent ones? Is one or the other a stronger argument in your view? Is there a better way that Callicles could have responded to Socrates? What is the relationship between goodness and pleasure in your view? Is the human good to be identified with pleasure and the bad with pain? Is pleasure a part of the human good, but not the whole of it? If you think that it is a part of the human good, what are the other parts, and how are they balanced against one another? Or are pleasure and the human good totally separate things altogether? Once one accepts that there is an essential distinction between goodness and pleasure, then one is free to concede that some pleasures are good, some are bad, and some are better than others. If there's an essential distinction between goodness and pleasure, you're free to concede that some pleasures are good, some are bad, and some are better than others. And this is what Callicles finally does. This is at 499b, page 76. He basically concedes this to Socrates. This concession raises a further practical problem, however. How does one identify and pick out the good pleasures and distinguish them from the bad ones? For Socrates, this devolves into the question of which craft or techne is concerned with what is best for the soul. Good pleasures will be those that improve the health of the soul, and bad pleasures are those that worsen the health of the soul. And I guess morally neutral pleasures, although it's not clear to what extent Socrates would accept those, the idea of morally neutral pleasures, but they would neither improve nor worsen the health of the soul. But Socrates proposes that there's a craft, a techne, that is concerned with those pleasures that improve the health of the soul and those that worsen the health of the soul. In surveying the arts that aim merely at gratifying an audience, Socrates gets Callicles to agree that these are not crafts that aim at improving the soul, but are merely forms of flattery. This is beginning around 501c, page 79 and following. There are these arts that aim at producing pleasures that just gratify an audience. They don't aim at improving the soul, and so they're demoted from the rank of a craft or a techne to merely the rank of flattery. A crucial case, of course, is oratory. In this case, Socrates argues from analogy with other crafts and from the absence of any proven examples of orators who have improved their citizens. He argues that oratory, as it has been practiced in Greece, historically up to the present, is just another species of flattery. Oratory, practically speaking, as it's actually existed, is just another species of flattery, and it's not concerned with the betterment of the soul. However, he concedes that there theoretically could be a true oratory, which he equates with the craft of politics, or at least strongly associates them, that a true oratory or a politics that could be concerned with moral betterment instead of flattery, with giving speeches that are aimed not at pleasing or gratifying the audience, at producing the most pleasure, but rather at improving their soul, bettering their soul. But we lack concrete examples of these things, or almost all concrete examples, except for Socrates himself, as he says at 521d, page 105. The evidence for this, he says, is that he doesn't appeal to what is most pleasant. But of course, Socrates typically wouldn't be regarded as an orator. In fact, that's Callicles' whole point, is that Socrates, you don't know how to do oratory. And Socrates says, well, that's because you identify oratory with mere flattery, whereas I'm doing the true oratory, the politics, the true politics that aims at the improvement of the souls of the audience and not merely the gratification of their appetites and producing the most pleasure. And that is something that is rare. Even the politicians that we're familiar with are typically concerned to flatter their audience, to appeal to their appetites, to gratify them, to tell them they're the greatest, right? If they're not ripping down their opponents. And this is not what true politics is for Socrates. It's telling them, look, you need to look into your own soul and consider improving yourself. And if you have a corrupt soul, then your appetite certainly should not be indulged. Just like if you have a sick body, you shouldn't be eating things, right? If you have emphysema, you shouldn't be smoking cigarettes. If you have, some kind of an intestinal virus, you shouldn't be eating rich foods and so on. So that's the analogy. There's this analogy between the soul and the body and the gratification of the appetites of the soul and the appetites of the body and the pleasures of the soul and so forth. But to truly cement this argument, Socrates needs a criterion of the healthy soul. What's the criterion of the healthy soul? How do we distinguish the unhealthy soul from the healthy soul? And for this, he also looks to the example of the other crafts. Whatever craft you consider, the good craftsman always seeks to impart a certain order and organization to his product. So we see examples of this. This is page 82 through 83, 503D through 504B. He says, let's examine the matter calmly and see whether any of these men has proved to be like that. That is, those who are concerned to make the soul better. Well then, won't the good man, the man who speaks with regard to what's best, say whatever he says not randomly, but with a view to something? Just like the other craftsmen, each of whom keeps his own product in view and does not select and apply randomly what he applies, but so that he may give his product some shape. Take a look at painters, for instance, if you would, or house builders, or shipwrights, or any of the other craftsmen you like, and see how each one places what he does into a certain organization and compels one thing to be suited for another and to fit to it until the entire object is put together in an organized and orderly way. So all of the crafts are concerned with fitting things together in an orderly, organized way. If you're a shipwright, you're fitting together the wood in an ordered and organized way. Same if you're a house builder and so forth. So the other craftsmen too, including the ones we mentioned lately, but ones concerned with the body, physical trainers and doctors, no doubt give order and organization to the body. Do we agree that this is so or not? Maybe in the case of a doctor, the most literal example will be, let's say, someone who's got a compound fracture and needs the bone to be set, right? It needs to be put back into the proper order. Callicles says, basically, fine. So if a house gets to be organized or orderly, it would be a good one. And if it gets disorganized, it would be a terrible one. That's the claim, that there's an analogy between health and good order, and likewise sickness and disorder. So this is true of a house, it's true of a boat, and Socrates says it's also true of the soul. It will be a good one if it gets to be organized, and a bad one if it gets to be disorganized. So this is the idea. A healthy soul will be a properly ordered soul as opposed to a disordered and disorganized soul. But what's an orderly soul then? And Socrates says, well, this is the same thing as a just and self-controlled soul. This is a theory that gets elaborated in much more detail in Plato's Republic. We'll have some videos on that coming up later on in the season. But for now, we can just say that intuitively, this idea that the soul that has self-control, that doesn't let its appetites get out of whack, right? That doesn't spend, this is almost the definition of addiction, when you're, as it were, pursuing the pursuit of whatever you're addicted to the point where it's forcing you to sacrifice other things that you have as your ends and goals in life, right? So to have a properly ordered soul, in that sense, is to have your soul be justly balanced, have an appropriate balance. Think about the image of justice as the scales, right? You want to have the balance in your soul. And that involves controlling the appetites, controlling the parts of your soul, and so on. It might even involve psychological health, might even involve not just controlling the appetites, but even, let's say, controlling your thoughts. If you're given to, let's say, anxious rumination over things that might happen to you in your life, that might lead to mental ill health, and you need to control your thoughts and put them back into balance. That seems to be the intuitive idea. So Socrates summarizes this whole line of argument on 87, where he says, this is 507a, I say that if the self-controlled soul is a good one, then a soul that's been affected the opposite way of a self-controlled one is a bad one. And this, it's turned out, is the foolish and undisciplined one. And surely a self-controlled person would do what's appropriate with respect to both gods and human beings. For if he does what's inappropriate, he wouldn't be self-controlled. And of course, if he did what's appropriate with respect to human beings, he would be doing what's just. And with respect to gods, he would be doing what's pious. And the one who does what's just and pious must necessarily be just and pious. Yes, and he would also necessarily be brave, for it's not like a self-controlled man to either pursue or avoid what isn't appropriate, but to avoid and pursue what he should, whether these are things to do or people or pleasures and pains, and to stand fast and endure them where he should. So it's necessarily very much the case, Callicles, that the self-controlled man, because he's just and brave and pious, as we've recounted, is a completely good man. That the good man does well and admirably whatever he does, and that the man who does well is blessed and happy, while the corrupt man, the one who does badly, is miserable. And this would be the one who is in his condition opposite to the self-controlled one, the undisciplined one, whom you were just praising, Callicles. So this is how I set down the matter, and I say that this is true. And if it is true, then a person who wants to be happy must evidently pursue and practice self-control. Well, at this point in the dialogue, the core argument is basically completed. Plato goes on for a number of pages, repeating and reinforcing the main points, and showing that Callicles remains unconverted, or at best partially converted, frustrated with Socrates and irritated by him, which seems to have been a common response to Socrates, especially by sophists. But even so, Callicles is more or less thrown in the towel at this point. The dialogue ends, however, on an intriguing note. Socrates introduces into the discussion of moral goodness and justice and the health of the soul the issue of the afterlife, which is something that up to now has been missing in the ethics of the Gorgias, although, of course, for many who are coming from a religious tradition, this is an important part of their conception of the moral life. And in particular, he's got a conception that is very much at home in certainly the Christian and the Muslim traditions of an afterlife where there is rewards for the good and punishment for evildoers. And he says on page 107, this is 522e, no one who isn't totally bereft of reason and courage is afraid to die. Doing what's unjust is what he's afraid of. For of all evils, the ultimate one is that of arriving in Hades with one's soul stuffed full of unjust actions. If you like, I'm willing to give you an account showing that this is so. And Socrates says, well, since I can't shut you up, sure, give it to me. And he gives this interesting account. If you didn't make it to the end, which is understandable, it's a long reading, but this is another example of Plato's literary artistry and genius, and it's a fun and interesting account. It's interesting to compare with other accounts of the afterlife with which you might be aware. But I mention this here and call this out because this is worth thinking about. What exactly is the place of this idea of rewards and punishment in the afterlife in the overall conception of the good life, and also of the rationality of the good life in making, as it were, our calculations as to how we want to live the best life. And there might be seen to be a kind of tension here in Socrates' account, and we can think about this as a kind of unofficial fourth discussion question. I've already given three official ones, so that's enough for one, but this could be, perhaps if we get to it, an unofficial fourth discussion question, which is, what role, if any, does the existence of an afterlife in which there will be rewards for the morally good, those who led a morally good life, and punishments for evildoers, what role does this play in the justification of a moral life? Is this idea that Socrates gives of soul health, mental health, psychological health, is it that itself a sufficient reward, or is this religious supplement necessary as well, belief in an afterlife, in order to, as it were, fill in the picture of what all the motives are and the happiness that's aimed at in the moral life. So I'd like you to think about that too.